2 days ago, I attended what felt to me like one of the most impactful scientific meetings I have ever been to. And I felt compelled to share this with you today. I do have some notes. I have quite a few bullets that I want to get to today, so if you'll bear with me, I think this will be worth it because this meeting is transforming the way I think about the future of science, and I really do think you are going to value hearing about this. So, this is a special and inaugural solo episode of the Cool Boards podcast. Let's get into it. So first up, let me just set this up with a little bit of context here. So this was a meeting about the impact of artificial intelligence on science, and it was held at the Institute of Advanced Study. It was an internal meeting. It wasn't supposed to be like an open call that people were invited to. And so in that sense, my attendance was kind of accidental. It was fortuitous. I happened to be visiting Princeton on the Tuesday to give the astronomy colloquium, which I gave and had many great interactions with faculty and students that day. But then the following day, they often pack you off to 2 miles down the road to visit the Institute of Advanced Study, which is its own separate institute filled with many other great astrophysicists amongst many other academics as well. So I was attending the IAS that day, Institute of Advanced Study, and there was this coffee meeting at 11 a.m. led by one of the senior astrophysicist faculty at the institute. I won't say who it was to protect their identity because, there's a lot to be shared here, but suffice to say, this is somebody of enormous scientific stature in the field who many of us look up to, and he led this meeting that was fairly shocking, actually, to attend it. I think a lot of what I'm about to tell you was somewhat internalized, at least for me personally. I was well aware of the impact of AI on my field, and I had my own thoughts about how it was benefiting me and the risks that it might have for the future. But it was what was so shocking about this meeting is that all of this was said out loud. This wasn't just, the voices in my own head. Everybody was saying the same thing. Everyone was saying the same. We're all on the same chorus, right? And that was what really struck me, was that these are people I hold in the highest esteem, and they are coming to similar conclusions as myself. Now, the IAS setting is important to this story, right? Because the Institute of Advanced Study is one of the most elite intellectual institutes on planet Earth. This is where Einstein worked, right? This is where Oppenheimer worked. If you've seen the movie Oppenheimer, there's scene shot there. This is the home of so many generations of brilliant physicists and many other academics as well. Just when I was walking down the corridor, I actually passed Ed Witten, who is considered not only one of the fathers of string theory, but one of the most brilliant living minds. I mean, one of the smartest human beings on planet Earth. And these are the corridors that you are sharing at the IAS. So I think that context is important because I think it gives a lot of credence to what I'm about to tell you, right? These are big voices. This is not Silicon Valley tech bros. These are not billionaires. This is not hype. These are people who have built their career on analytic thinking, technical work, mathematical development, abstract thought. These are truly thought leaders here. Okay, so with that context said, the meeting itself, what was it really about? So it was led primarily by this one senior faculty who spent most of the time, about maybe 30, 40 minutes, discussing sort of agentic AI especially. So things like Claude, Cursor, there was a little bit of GPT discussion in there as well, but it was especially focused on those models and how he was using it in his own research and beyond in his own life. He was, organizing travel and stuff like that and emails using these systems, but primarily it was about research. And he showed many examples of research projects being achieved with just a few prompts, and how these systems were so powerful that they were delivering very, very impressive results at the cutting edge of what we would expect for a scientific paper. So that was the first sort of 30 minutes or so showing that off. And then after that, there was also a historian present. He was actually on Zoom, the historian, but the historian gave some comments towards the end of the meeting, and then it was opened up. I mean, there was just some discussion happening during the meeting as well, some hands coming up, but then there was kind of an open forum of discussion at the end in which I certainly participated as well. Okay, so the first big shocker. Well, I don't think it is a shocker. Like I said, I think I'd internalized this already, but to hear it said out loud was jarring. And this was that AI models had now achieved complete coding supremacy over humans, software development. And this is not small talk. I mean, remember the audience who are in this room. Remember the people who are here. Astrophysicists, I mean, they're not by profession software developers per se, but they do a lot of them do an enormous amount of software development. I mean, you're thinking about these large cosmological simulations like ENSO, Illustris, Gadget, hydrodynamic simulations with adaptive mesh grids, and a lot of modern, especially modeling work in astrophysics is heavily based in computers about how to do these extremely sophisticated software developments to simulate the universe itself inside a machine. So, don't take that lightly. These are not these are not amateur coders. These are some really very, very talented coders, and there was not a single hand that objected to this. There was widespread concession that AI was not just better than humans, it had complete supremacy, and even the phrase order of magnitude superior was being used in the room. That was, I mean, it's certainly better than my coding skills. I'm a decent coder, but not a great coder. And, I just think, probably there's people out there who are much better than me that aren't threatened by this. But to hear that even those guys have just given up on this and that they've conceded that was a big deal. And to take this just a step further, it wasn't purely isolated to coding supremacy. There was also a concession that analytic reasoning, problem solving, mathematics, those skills were also comparable to the level of ability of the current AI systems, at least. And perhaps even there, they also have some level of, maybe not quite supremacy, but advantage, superiority at this point to the people in that room. Which, remember, I challenge you to find a room with a high average IQ. Right? This really was an astounding group of individuals that attend the IAS. So that was also quite startling. Now, I think there was an admission that many of the earlier AI models, ChatGPT 3.5, 4, etc., things like this, those earlier models, they certainly often did hallucinate mathematical solutions, and that is still happening to some degree, but that is becoming less and less and less frequent, and the results are becoming more and more trustworthy. So we still certainly need to check the results. Everyone is checking the results. I'll come to that point later. But the raw power of these things, when it gets it right, is extremely impressive. I know in my own work, I often do symbolic manipulation, solving differential equations, integrals, etc., with Wolfram products, so especially Mathematica. But you can also use Wolfram Alpha online by Stephen Wolfram, who of course is a brilliant mathematician who developed that software. And I think there was an idea that Wolfram would be eventually integrated into some of these models like ChatGPT. I think it still probably might happen at some point, maybe just as a cross-check. But I've been astonished, just as a personal anecdote, that in a recent set of derivations I was working on, Mathematica could not solve a whole, which isn't unusual. Often you come across integrals it can't solve. But ChatGPT could. This was with 5.2. And I was blown away by that. And not only could it solve these integrals, and of course I did check them, they were correct with numerical evaluations, it provided the entire derivation, which Mathematica does not do. It showed you all the substitutions, the rearrangements, how it was actually approaching this problem. And that was obviously far more valuable than the outcome, the output that you normally get from Mathematica. So that struck me. The lead faculty who was leading this discussion said this. I kind of had to write this down. That these models, in a very broad sense of the word, intellectually, can already do something like 90% of the things that he can do. 90%. Now, he wasn't sure about that number. He said it could be 60%, it could be 99%, but it was clear in his mind that it was a majority And it was only going to grow with obviously future versions of these models. And it had, broad scientific ability with just a few prompts. So that was also startling to hear. This is not just coding supremacy. This is much more than that. Okay, so the next point I want to raise was, and this might be unique to the senior faculty who led this discussion, I'm not sure, although a few hands did agree with what he was doing, that he had totally surrendered control of his digital life, essentially, to agentic AI. So he'd handed over his emails, his file system, full access to his computer, calendars. He'd given pseudo control, super user control, as we'd say in Unix, to his personal machines and servers and disk space, all of that. And yeah, around a third of the room, when there was a hand raised, ask for hands raised, said that they had also installed these agentic AI systems doing this kind of stuff. So I certainly haven't done that. I actually haven't used any agentic AI systems. I've never used Claude or Cursor, which were the two main systems people were talking about here. I've just really been interacting via a web portal with GPT whenever I've sort of needed these systems. And that made me feel like I was way behind the curve, actually, to some degree. But also, people said, some of the people in the room said, aren't you uncomfortable about that? Like, have you read the privacy details of these contracts that you're handing over your entire life to these machines? And what was startling is that he just said, I don't care. I don't care. The advantage that it affords me is so great, is so outsized, that it's irrelevant to me that I'm losing all these privacy controls. Now, many of us will probably disagree with that, I'm sure, but that is not an extreme view, because people agreed with him in that room, and that was also startling for me to hear, that we are moving into an era where not just your average person using these machines, but these brilliant minds, these intellectual powerhouses, are handing over as much intellectual labor as they possibly can to these machines. Along the same lines, another startling revelation here, and this wasn't an institutional endorsement, right? There was no formal representative from the IAS administration here or Princeton, I think, talking. This was just among, an informal discussion kind of amongst academics, but they were embracing this. And there was a sense of how can we even accelerate the adoption of these technologies. So they were actually in the process. One of the purposes of this meeting was to form a group where everyone could get into these systems, they could learn how to install them quickly, they could learn how to set up skills and rules and things like this, and how to set up prompts better, how to do prompt engineering, all that stuff. So there was a sense of, we're not trying to resist this. We are trying to get everybody who is interested, at least, with a prod to do so, clearly by the sales pitch of all the numerous successful examples the senior faculty were showing to us, that this should be something you get on the train with. This is not something that we encourage you to resist. Embrace it. And so an obvious counter to that, and nobody actually raised this point explicitly in rebuttal to the lead discussion, but the senior faculty lead discussion acknowledged it, is ethics. And I know this bothers some of you, and we have that point later, don't we? We'll come to your concerns about ethics and other things with AI later. But it was acknowledged, and the senior faculty said, I'm going to paraphrase a little bit here, but the tone was similar. I acknowledge, there's all these concerns, billionaires, and it will replace jobs, and power consumption, climate change effects of all this water and energy it's using, and those concerns exist, but I don't care. I don't care, because the advantage is too great. And that was startling. It was like, ethics be damned, right? And I'm not trying to throw this senior faculty into the bus, because I don't think it was an isolated view, that despite the fact there are many reservations about using these models, there was a sense that you have to do this if you want to be competitive in this environment. And the advantages were so great that it completely overwhelmed such concerns. Now, the next sort of concern that was raised, I think, more during the discussion, the Q&A part of the session, was about scale atrophy. Now, this is my own analogy that I thought of afterwards, but a good analogy is thinking about how we use GPS systems, navigation systems. If you go back, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago or something, before we all had these little computers in our pockets that could navigate you anywhere, we had, I think, a better sense of direction. I certainly did. I kind of had a 3D map in my mind of where I was. But naturally, when you have these awesome navigation machines, you just defer to it. And it's easy. You can drive and just kind of stop thinking about where you're going and start thinking about other, physics problems or whatever it is in your mind, or what you're gonna have for dinner tonight. You can kind of tune out a little bit and concentrate less, and it's easier. Not everyone does that. I know some of you probably are fighting that. I'm not going to use GPS. I want to keep those map skills fresh. But in the same sense, if we defer, certainly software development, that's already gone. Are we going to atrophy on our coding skills? And clearly what's happening already right now and maybe around the corner is mathematical skills, analytic skills, but even more general than that is just problem solving. Because with these agentic AI systems, you just guide it. You set it up. You define the problem, and maybe you go a little bit further than that and modularize it and compartmentalize it, things like that, and we'll talk about that. But primarily, it's the one that solves the problem. And that's worrying. Right? Will we forget how to do these core skills as scientists? That sounds very unattractive, right? To lose all of our skill sets as scientists because we've spent years, decades training for that, right? I did an undergraduate degree at Cambridge, and then I did a master's, and then I did a PhD, and then I had training as a postdoc. So it seems a little bit wild that anyone would be willing to let go of all of that investment. But I think the case that was being made for using these was a sort of sense of inevitability. And I think a lot of us feel this with these AI systems, that if you don't use these systems, the IAS doesn't use these systems, Princeton uses this, Columbia doesn't use, whoever, these institutions, these top institutions, or even other institutions, that if they don't use them, they just will not be competitive in what is happening, what is to come, and the avalanche of discovery that might be around the corner. So the adoption was somewhat unavoidable. And, I was just thinking about it in the drive back. I was thinking, it's a bit like Adam and Eve picking the forbidden fruit off the tree, right? And the serpent is these AI companies saying here, why don't you grab this apple off the tree? And the problem is, once you grab that apple, you've lost innocence. There's no way back once you do that, right? Because of the risk of skill atrophy, that you're going to have this allure of enormous productivity boost. And I do worry about the fact we have little choice here but to do it if we want to be competitive, and yet we recognize and are cognizant of the many deep concerns that it would have about our own intellectual abilities. So another point I want to raise here was about training of these models, and I really mean human training, not the training sets that these AI companies are using. There was an acknowledgement that when you first encounter one of these models, you've only used it once or twice before in your life, and maybe it was even a year or two ago when these things were outdated, it's usually a pretty frustrating experience. You normally ask it to do something, and it just crap comes out the other end, right? It's just not what you wanted at all, and it can be very frustrating. And especially because it talks to you like a human, you tend to interact with it like a human. And that includes getting emotionally sometimes angry at it, that it's frustrated that it's not doing what you want to do. And a lot of people just kind of chuck it out the window and say, well, yeah, forget this. It's quicker for me just to do this myself than to use this stupid model. And the lead faculty even acknowledged that. He said he has wasted, you call it wasted, you call it investment, but he has spent a long time trialing, erroring how to use these systems correctly. It's not like you just pick it up out of the box and you're going to get incredible results. So this is like developing AI fluency, how to set up a problem, how to set up your workflow, setting up these different skills and systems that get the results that you want. And so that, in a sense, that means that people who do invest the time, the early adopters that are getting into the systems right now, will arguably have a significant edge. But I think that's important to acknowledge, that you shouldn't just expect to pick it up and run with it. And that is kind of the reason why this group were interested in setting up an accelerator to train the scientists in that room who were interested, was voluntary, who were interested in engaging with these products and how to get up to speed with them. All right, this is a big one. This is human oversight. And this was peppered throughout the entire discussion. There was no part of this session that this was not being frequently reminded, although I've just put it as one block here. When you produce these results, they're not always reliable, right? We all know that. They hallucinate especially, but that is getting better. But even today, I've had many interactions over the last week where there was stuff that came out that was just wrong. You could just see it's wrong. So you still need to cross-check, right? Humans do need to cross-check these results. That could be looking at plots. That could be looking at snippets of code, running them internally, checking things work, discussing the results with AI, interpreting them, thinking about them for yourself as well. So that the human brain is still activated. We are not completely discharged from any intellectual oversight here, but it is a very different kind of intellectual activity. It's more like the exclusive role of just being a mentor or an advisor or a manager, really, in that sense, rather than necessarily working through the problem yourself. Indeed, a lot of those cross-checks he conceded, he was doing them between the AI models. So he'd run the same problem through Cursor, then he'd put it through Claude, then he'd discuss the results in GPT. So he was making sure they all kind of agreed with each other as well. And that was obviously a way to sort of speed up that cross-checking process. And there was also an acknowledgement that certainly between Cursor and AI, when you use Cursor, I've never used either of these, by the way, but what he presented was that when you use Cursor, you can actually see the changes made to your code. So actually do a diff, as we call it. So you can actually see, like, it highlights this bit of code I'm editing here in this new revision. Whereas with Claude, the way he described it, and some of you might know better than me, was that it kind of sends off all these sub-agents that solve different parts of the problem. And so there's a lot of stuff happening under the hood that is less transparent. And so you might be opposed to that. And indeed, when this faculty was first using these systems, he strongly favored Cursor because he could see what was going on. But as his trust level has grown with these models, he's finding that transparency actually an annoyance at this point, and would rather he's so willing to trust these models at this point because he's seen evidently how impressive they are, how reliable they are, that he's now switching to Claude because it's just faster and it can go further, in his words, to achieve some of these project goals. You can just use fewer prompts and let it kind of get on with its own thing. So that was also interesting that human oversight was there, but if there are ways to even dial that back to a minimum, that's already happening. I mean, extrapolate that trend. Who knows where this human oversight thing will even persist. All right, cost. I'm sorry, we have a lot of points here. I appreciate you sticking with it. Hopefully this is interesting to you. But cost was something I was worried about. I actually raised this point in the meeting. So the senior faculty who's leading this said, GPT is like what, $20 a month for the Plus, Claude, Cursor, all these systems have their own price tags, and he was already spending hundreds of dollars a month of his own personal money to have these systems. And that's what the power users are doing. And so that already prices a lot of people out. All right, especially you might imagine early career people on lower salaries than someone at the IAS would be priced out. And even people at other institutions or other parts of the country or other parts of the world might not have the same kind of financial resources to buy a membership, a subscription to all of these AI systems. So that's already introducing kind of an inequity to a certain degree. And further, the real concern I have here, or another concern I have here, is the exploding cost. Now, this hasn't happened yet, But I'm just sort of analogizing by thinking about what's happened with so many subscription services that we've got used to in life. Such as like Netflix and streaming services, but also just even downloading software, right? It's kind of rare that you can buy software and it's just a one price and done. They all want subscriptions, and those subscription prices creep up and up and up. And we could easily imagine a world where these models are so cheap right now, we all get addicted to them, our skills go through this atrophy process, we forget how to do coding, analytic thinking, problem solving, because we become so dependent on these machines that 2 or 3 years in, they kind of pull the rug from under us. And suddenly they say, okay, now you need to start paying several $1,000s per month for the same thing. And many people probably will, because that the field has now kind of acclimatized to this level of productivity. And so the expectation has shifted, the Overton window in a sense has shifted about what normal is. And so that kind of worries me that at any moment we could be susceptible to these AI companies just completely revamping that. And I raised that point, and the senior faculty, again, just didn't really care about that. He said that, doesn't matter. Like it is what it is now. And so I'm going to use it now whilst it's available, because the boost is just so big. So it's often just come back to that same point. And to follow on with the costing issue, another point here is, how are these, think from the other side. When you're playing chess, you always think about what the other player's thinking. What are these AI companies going to do for financial return here? Because we know there are trillions of dollars that investors have put into these companies, right? So this is startling, but I looked this up. There's the current amount of AI investment since something like 2014, 2015 or so, in the top 3 or 4 companies now is over 5 times that which was invested in the entire Apollo program. Over 5 times inflation adjusted, and over 50 times that of the Manhattan Project. I don't think there's ever been a human endeavor in all of human history that we've invested so much into a technology, into a project like this. Now, that's a lot of money, and they have to get that back. Right? The investors expect to get that back. I know many of you might be investors. Many of you probably know a lot more about this than I do. And I'm just sort of wondering how they're going to do that. And yeah, it could be price jacking. They could just raise the prices. But another thing that was discussed, not in the meeting itself, but over lunch. And by the way, I should say that once this coffee meeting happened, the whole day of discussion was dominated by AI after this. My lunches, my coffees, the dinner is all people could talk about was AI. It was really a startling kick to everybody to focus on this. But what came up over lunch was that one way these companies could try to recover some of that investment, and why the AI companies are pivoting a little bit towards scientific development. You often hear, Sam Altman talk about fusion power and drug discovery, things like this. And the reason is because they could try and claim some of that IP and some of the patent shares, right? So you could imagine there one day being like a GPT Pro or something, or research grade version, where part of the terms of service mean that you give up, 10%, 20%, half of the IP to OpenAI or whoever it is, whichever company you're using. And if they're going to dig out of the hole, and again, I'm not an economics expert, I also want to be clear about that. I have no expertise in this whatsoever. But if they're going to dig out of this hole, which sounds enormous, $2 trillion or so, they need to get a lot of money back. And so this kind of promise, and these are really my own words, this wasn't something discussed in the meeting, this promise that we often hear from these tech billionaires that fusion power will come and we'll be in this age of abundance and there'll be so many great free drugs. How can it be cheap and affordable if they have to reclaim all of those investments? Surely that means they're going to have to charge a lot for those drugs, a lot for fusion power. I don't know. And if that did happen, you would have to kind of question the whole point of doing this in the first place, right? So the cost thing is interesting. I want to hear your comments in the below about that. All right, so let's shift gears a little bit to who wins and who loses in this new AI world. Now, traditionally, in a very technical subject like physics and astrophysics, those who have an edge, have an advantage, often have superior technical skills. It could be, solving differential equations, abstract math. It could be coding ability, thinking of, developing advanced simulations. There's a lot of technical skills that go into a successful astrophysicist. And I guess what's interesting here is a lot of those skills, those advantages, are neutralized by these models. So just the people who will be successful going forward will not be the same type of person, potentially, as we've seen for the last few centuries in science. It will be a different breed, a different type of intellect and skill set that will thrive. In New York, there's this institute called the Flatiron Institute, and they have a group there called CCA, the Center for Computational Astrophysics. And in that department, which is a private foundation, funded by a private foundation, they have had a strong emphasis on hiring software developers, because this is often one of those skills which is underappreciated in the job market. So if you're an astrophysicist and your whole shtick is developing software, for years and years and years, it's been hard to get a faculty job than, let's say, your shtick was solving equations. Because for whatever reason, it was just kind of looked down upon by some physicists, like, oh, that's not real physics. You're not a real physicist, you're just a software developer. And so the CCA had this big program where they're like, you know what? That doesn't make sense, because so much of astrophysics is advanced by software development. We need these people. We need to prop them up. We need to have them in our field. But with coding supremacy, what happens to that? Will those jobs still exist? I'm curious. I mean, maybe I should talk to Dave Spergel, who's the head of Flatiron here, and hear his thoughts about this at some point, because he's been on the podcast before. But I'm really curious, like, what's going to happen to those kind of software-oriented positions? Maybe they'll just look different. Maybe there'll be people who really just manage software development, and it's the agentic AIs that do all the software development. I don't know, but it's certainly going to be disruptive to some of those assumptions about who gets hired and who doesn't. The other interesting thing here is wealth, right? So if you have more money, if your institution has more money, and if these models eventually jack up the price and you have to pay for units of reasoning, however they price that, then obviously having access to a massive endowment at Harvard or Princeton or Columbia would be advantageous for your institution. And so it could become a little bit more like oligarchic disruption of actually educational and research institutions themselves. And then finally, just the actual people who will thrive. I mean, I've kind of alluded to this already, but I think they're people who will be able to compartmentalize problems, break them down into individual steps, because that's often how you feed them, at least at the moment, into these models. And it requires a lot of patience for the reasons we talked about. Like, these models can be frustrating. And if you get emotionally worked up easily and you think of it as like a human interaction, because it certainly portrays itself like a human interaction, the way it talks to you, it's easy to get like pissed off with it and spend half an hour, and it's the lead faculty can see that. He said he spent hours like all caps screaming on the keyboard at these models, like, why didn't you do the thing I wanted you to do, you stupid thing? I think we've all had that interaction with these models, and that is not a good trait to have to make the most of these models. You just have to sort of understand that it's not a person, and you need to control your own emotional reactions in return when you're interacting with them. So managerial skills, patience, modularization, I think all of those will be maybe what the next generation of super scientists actually looks like. So who loses out of this? Now, we already said that it may be people with technical brilliance inherent, they just have a ridiculous ability to solve equations. They're not going to be advantaged. I don't know if they lose, but they're not advantaged by this system. The people who lose, I think we're already kind of saying this in industry, right? So we have industry internships and junior positions evaporating because a lot of companies, especially software development, tech companies, they recognize that it's just way cheaper for them to hire use these models rather than hire someone to do this work. So certainly that could, I don't think it really has yet, but that could proliferate into academic training, into research training, that We might not have the same number of graduate students being trained across the country, the same number of PhDs, the same number of undergraduate degrees even. And, some of the motivation for this is that I'm not trying to defend this. I'm not trying to say like, oh, we should stop having graduate students. That's not, to be clear, that's not a world I'm looking forward to. But I'm just going to sort of give you 3 reasons why this might happen. Okay, just to be clear, before I forget on the keyboard. Okay, so training scientists takes time and effort, right? For me as a mentor, for any faculty who has to teach someone how to do research, it's a big amount of training and time investment for us. I don't think people recognize that. I'm always a little bit amazed at the end of a 5-year PhD, which is the length of PhD here in the US, typically. At the end of the degree, you have this like fully formed scientist, and you can truly collaborate, chat with them like a peer. They're at the peak of their game. They're running, they're sprinting. And when you go back just 5 years, and that you get this idea of like treating all grad students the same, but then the first year grad student walks through your door, and you sit down and start to talk science with them, and their face just goes blank, and you realize they don't know really anything. I mean, they know some stuff, but their level is so far below the 5th year graduate student level. You have to recalibrate your expectation. It's a little bit disheartening. You're like, oh man, all right, we have to, for the 100th time, I have to go back to the basics again with someone. And that's a cycle we go through. And it's actually, there's a very rewarding aspect to that. When you see their eyes light up and they get something, it's great. I always love that feeling as a teacher. You know that, because otherwise why would I do these YouTube videos? But it is a huge time sink for a faculty. You're having like several hours of meeting every week with these people to train them up. And you might have, a group of 5 students like that. So you can easily block up half of your time just training students. And you don't have to train these models. They just out of the tin work. And it was pointed out in this meeting that, especially like a first year PhD project, we normally give them kind of like a light project, like here's a little project that I could probably solve this project in a month, maybe even less than that. But I'm going to give it to you to solve in a year. And that'll be helpful for you to learn how research really works. And it'll be an interesting result at the end of the day as well. But these models, they can do the same thing in like a few prompts. So it does somewhat hit that benefit of getting more research done. Because, if I did it myself, sure, I could have done it myself, but it would have spent me maybe a month of effort or 2 weeks of effort, let's say, to do that. But now I can do it in an afternoon or a morning. And then the calculus might look different. So that's one factor. Another factor is just the cost. So it costs me, to my grants, when I hire a graduate student, once you fold in the health insurance and the tuition, all this kind of stuff, it's of order of $100,000 a year. That's typical for many of the top institutions across the country, $100,000 a year, which we fund from grants. And of course, some of you are supporting Cool Worlds Lab directly, and some of that money does indeed go to supporting the training of people, which I'm very grateful for. But compare that to the cost of $20 a month. That's an ocean apart, right? So certainly in this environment we have right now of enormous grant pressure with the current administration, like a lot of federal grants are being cut, it's de-incentivizing. Those 2 things together compound a little bit to de-incentivize. And I think the third one is, you might say, well, look, none of that matters because it's about morality. It's about ethics. You have a responsibility as an educator to train scientists. That's what we do. That's part of our job. And it is not about how much research they produce or how much they cost. It's about producing this scientist who will go out into society and do great things. That's the real product. And I believe that. But the counterweight to that, again, I'm not advocating for this, but I can imagine a counterweight to that being, this is folly, because there will be no human scientists in 5 years. So why are you spending 5 years training a scientist with this ethical goal of producing a human scientist when those beings will not even exist in 5 years? This is futile. I'm not advocating for that, to be clear once again. I could imagine that argument being made. So this is all just to say there are several factors which particularly early career scientists have a greater risk, a greater vulnerability of being displaced or affected in a negative way, I think, by these technologies, maybe. It's something we're worried about because we really care deeply about keeping this flame of research going to the next generation. And these are all things that are deeply worrying. So along the same-ish lines is grad admissions, so graduate admissions. So when we admit students to start a PhD at Columbia or whatever institute it is, we get a lot of applications. It actually went down a bit, well, quite a bit this year, I think, across the country because of international students finding it being de-incentivized so much to come to the US this year. But normally it's of order of sort of 400 applications, at least at Columbia, for basically 4 or 5 positions. So it's of order of like 1% admission rate, which is wild, right? I mean, there's already something kind of problematic there, but that's the current rate. Now, that's a difficult process, right? Because yes, there'll be some junk applications in there, but by and large, a lot of them are serious applications. And that we often try and nail it down to a long list of maybe like 30 or 40 people. And when you look at that long list, you're like, wow, these are all great people. They have so much skills, but it takes a lot of time for the faculty to do that work. And there's a lot of disagreement amongst the faculty and the admissions committee about what kind of person are we looking for? What kind of skills should we be focusing on for the next generation or the next cohort that we're going to have in this class? So there's 2 factors there. Like one, well, first I'll say the actual admissions process itself, the senior faculty who's leading this discussion conceded that they indeed use these AI models not to do their grad admissions, but to assist. It's unclear to me to what degree that assistance was happening, but he said it was the fastest and most accurate. He felt the best about the reliability of those admissions he'd ever felt. But that's interesting. I'm sure, on the other hand, applicants are using GPT, especially international students, I'm sure, because the English advantage of using these models would be obvious. The language skills would be enormous by doing that. So certainly I suspect applicants are using these models. But interestingly, on the other side, it's already happening. That's interesting. I don't know what to really comment about that, but that's an interesting point I want to share with you. The second is, what skills are we really selecting for? So there is no strict agreement amongst different institutions, even different faculty within the same institution, about what skill set I want to select for. Some think that we need to, focus on collaborative skills. That's like the most important thing because science is inherently collaborative. Others would argue, no, it's about their technical ability. It's about their ability to write these simulation codes. Like how much hydro simulations have they done so far? Let's look at their track record with that. Others would say it doesn't really matter. It's just about how many research experiences they've had. How do they present? How do they communicate? Because communication is fundamental to what's the point of being a great scientist if you can't tell people about what you've done? So there's a wide array of different skills that we think about when we select grad students. No one neuters any of those. They all just have different weights, right? So there'll be different. Some people will say they're all equally valid. Other people will say that technical skills are more important. Other people say collaborative skills. So it's just different. And you do have to wonder, because the degree is 5 years at least. Some people take a bit more than that. It's a 5-year degree. And we are admitting people with a certain set of criteria, which are largely traditional, I think, at this point. The same criteria we've more or less been using for the past probably 100 years or so. And you do have to wonder whether the people we're selecting are truly the right people. Do they have the right skill set to thrive in an environment in 5 years' time from now? And I mean, that's a recurrent problem. I have kids. I have 2 young children. I have the same kind of issue. I just don't know what to tell them to do, what to focus on, what training to look at. And that's just another kind of side of this coin. So when we do admissions, what skills do we select for? And certainly I've been thinking a lot recently, like, would I actually admit a student anymore? Or not admit, but because that's done by the admissions committee, but would I agree to work with a student who refused to use these models completely? Which some students feel that way. They're like, I won't touch them for various reasons. I'm sure you have many objections yourselves you can think of for that. But it's not obvious to me. I would admit, I'd agree to work with a student like that, as hard as it is for me to confess that, because of kind of what was said by that senior faculty leading this discussion, the advantages are so enormous. It's like working with someone who refuses to use the internet or refuses to code in any software language. It's like you are putting like two giant hands tied behind your back by doing that. I don't know if I can work with someone who refuses to use the modern research tool set that becomes like the standard way of doing science. And that's not quite true yet, but it's clearly on the cusp of happening. So yeah, I'm still processing a lot of this. As you can tell, I don't have answers for you, but I think this is interesting to think about. Okay, last page. I promise you we're on the last page now. So the other thing that might lose here a little bit is collaborations. Some of you might not realize this, but when you're a scientist, you often need things from other people, right? So everyone has a finite skill set. There's certain things I can and can't do. I might need like an n-body dynamical code, for instance, and speak to a dynamicist about that. And so I could grab the code, I could use it, but to like truly edit it in a nuanced way to get to do what you want it to do, to maybe do something different, to think about a new problem, you need really that expertise, just as an example. And there's many, many types of collaborations, of course, that exist. But there is also a bit of inertia for some people. For some people, it's totally elevating. This isn't inertia at all, depending on your personality type. But you obviously have to reach out to these people. That's an obvious thing you have to do to collaborate with someone. You have to email them. You have to chat with them at a conference. You have to set up, probably multi-hour Zoom sessions with them to discuss the problem, look at the results, reflect on it. There's a time investment there. And especially if it's quick, especially if it's something really small, like I just need this one tiny little calculation that you're the guy for, then those I worry might disappear, right? Because if I just need like a little thing, especially, then what's easier for me to send a string of 3 or 4 emails without respond, keep going, hey, just re-upping this. I know you're busy, but do you have time to look at this problem? And they have to like read the whole paper to get the problem. And it's a lot of time investment for both parties for like this small increment. You can see there that AI would be preferable. And so, yeah, I do wonder whether the collaborations will diminish. I guess we'll see. But you'll see it reflected in the publication record if that's true. But I wonder if collaborations will shrink to kind of just the core people you really need, and eventually maybe even just single authors, right? I actually often write papers single author. But I wonder if that might become more common. It's kind of unusual actually these days for someone to write a single author paper, despite my peculiarity in that sense. But I question whether that might become more common. Although I do want to acknowledge that some people do science for the collaboration, right? Some people, that is the point of it. Like they love that social interaction and engaging with other people directly in the room. And for those people, this is not maybe applicable, but for many others, there's a lot of introverts in science. That's all I'm saying, right? And for those small things especially, I can imagine this being an issue. Okay, so last one, people like me, tenured faculty, and I'll talk about me specifically in a minute, but tenured faculty, I think everyone in the room acknowledged this, and especially in private conversations which I had throughout the day at the IAS afterwards, where this thing kept coming up over and over again, as I said, that tenured faculty will be fine. If there's going to be any victims or job displacement here, eventually we could get displaced, but we are going to be the last people on the boat, right? As the Titanic's going down, with the captains that go down with that ship, as the institutions themselves fall, tenured faculty would go down with it. Of course, the very definition of tenure, you'd have to rip it up to get rid of these people, right? So they're probably fine. Probably, you never know, but they're probably the last ones to go. And that was interesting that those people were freely admitting that. But I don't pretend that my job is infinitely safe, because the whole kind of point of this video. this job could go, and it actually could be one of the first jobs to go. I know, by the way, I said my last video was also about, I touched on AI a little bit, about how it could affect in a very positive way, I think, the development of telescopes. I am excited about that, how it could help. And I commented in there, and it generated a lot of comments back, that with the caveat that I'm not an economist, that I'm a little bit skeptical it could displace all jobs. That's what I said, all jobs. And to be clear, I mean all jobs. Scientists is not all jobs. I do think we are unusually vulnerable for displacement. You know, if you're going to rank order who's first on the chopping block, people doing intellectual labor would obviously be likely to be the most vulnerable if you have a machine that can do intellectual labor. Physical labor, no. So obviously there's plenty of jobs which are physical labor, and that's why I wouldn't say all jobs. But also, I'm not an economist, so I don't know what I'm talking about in a sense. But I do think it's certainly with science, I know what I'm talking about. And there is a great worry, as we've alluded throughout this video, that the skill sets we have are replicable, and in fact, even superior by some of these machines. And just on this point, one more thing related to tenured faculty is how we act as mentors and train students. And it's hard to find that balance. I mentioned I wasn't sure about whether I'd hire a student who didn't use AI or not. I'm still processing that. I'm still thinking about that. There's obviously a balance, right? Because you don't want to hire someone who's just brain dead because they just do everything they just type it into a prompt and that's it, and they never really think. We don't obviously want people who get that kind of forget how to use their heads. But at the same time, there's clearly a balance where you use it in a thoughtful way to boost your productivity. And so that balance, that's the thing we're looking for here. And I do not know how to find that balance, but I think it is a very important point that we have to think about how to identify that. Okay, so me personally and AI. So yeah, I'll talk about public backlash next. And I want to acknowledge that because, well, maybe I just contextualize it a little bit there. I do notice, especially in the last video, or if I use like an AI thumbnail or something, or an AI visual in the video, there's a lot of you get upset and you don't like it. And there's a lot of like, I don't want any AI slop. So let me talk about my use of AI. I want to be totally transparent with you. I don't want you to think that I've just suddenly started using AI and this is like a new thing. I have been using AI for almost as long as AI has existed. So for over a decade, I have been I've not just been using AI, I've actually been developing AI models. And we've been using machine learning and AI models, deep neural networks, to predict the stability of circumbinary planets and predicting missing planets in multi-planet systems, for instance, for over 10 years, as I said. And I helped write that code. So I kind of got out of the game about 8 or 9 years ago because it felt like, well, I was still using the models, but I stopped developing the AI models. And it wasn't for an ethical reason. It was just because I couldn't actually keep up with the pace of the literature. It kind of felt like either you go full AI at this point in terms of your intellectual interests, or if you want to remain broad like I did, you're probably not going to be competitive by just dabbling in AI anymore. So that's why I kind of took my foot out of it a little bit. But I still use the tools in many, many facets and always have. So proof checking papers is a real obvious one. Often we'll copy and paste the LaTeX source in and make it look for both factual errors, grammatical checks, things like that. Vibe coding. I mean, software development, writing code. I don't write all my code actually with AI. That's not true. Actually, I probably still write most of my code myself, but I often use it to generate functions and snippets of code, things like that, I'd say. But I'd still say the majority of the actual lines I type are probably my own lines. But I do use it a lot for vibe coding. Debugging, I mean, yeah, I almost never debug code myself anymore, I have to say. I pretty much always get an error message and I just copy and paste the snippet and the error message and say, what's wrong with this? It's just way faster. It's not why I became a scientist to debug code, believe it or not. So that's just easier. Proposal and report, not writing, but revisions. Again, that kind of proofing process. And really like think about how can I make this a compelling proposal? Think about ways this could really be interesting to the reviewer, like asking those kind of questions. Literature search, when you're trying to look for a paper, you're trying to see, has anyone ever done this before? That's kind of one of its worst things actually at the moment. It does often hallucinate references, but it's actually pretty simple just to Google the reference it told you and see that it's hallucinated. So it's not that hard to check that. Derivations in papers, like I said, I've used that quite a bit. TARS, right? As an example, TARS. So doing interdisciplinary stuff. So TARS is a lot of physics, and a lot of that physics I did, but there's also a lot of material science in it. I didn't know any material science. So I relied heavily on discovering like what are the tensile strengths, what kind of materials exist, what's the properties of graphene sheets, what materials have the right albedo, how many atom layer thick do I need of this to avoid certain transparency effects, that kind of stuff. I mean, I could do it, but it's just way easier to consult with a material expert in that case, which was the model. And I want to concede that I'm not a super user. I'm not in the same bracket as this guy who's leading this discussion. And I think my scientific strength has always been being creative. And I think that's actually kind of supercharged by these AI models. So in that sense, I'm enjoying using the models because I think it enables me to do more with the skill set that I have. And then with videos, because that's just research. With videos, yeah, I want to be honest with you, we use AI stuff quite a bit. We use a package called DX Revive to clean audio, to make it kind of have this kind of studio quality sound. Not always, but sometimes, like if it's rough audio, we'll often use it. We often take B-roll from movies and things, and sometimes we need to strip out the background music to fit with our own score. So we use a package called AI. If you know it, you know it. Rev.com for transcripts. We use Topaz sometimes for upscaling poor quality clips. We use GPT for fact checking scripts, video scripts, generating title ideas, brainstorming ideas on the titles, thumbnails. Yeah, we sometimes have, we know we have. We used a couple of, maybe 2 or 3 times we've used AI models to generate the entire visual, like a Gen AI model for the thumbnail, but it's kind of unusual. It's more common that I'll use it for like removing a background or something, like smartly removing background or even padding a background, something like that. But I do want to say that I have some video, some of my most popular videos are these stories, like Journey to the End of the Universe, Outlasting the Universe, things like this. The First Civilization. And the First Civilization, we commissioned an artist to generate some images, and she drew, I think, 5 images for me, and I had to really like spin those 5 images to not repeat them over and over again. So I kind of cropped them in different ways, mirrored them, colorized them in different ways. So yeah, I was trying to like really stretch that material, and I didn't really want to do that again. I have another narrative I want to do, another narrative video. And I was like, I don't want to do that again because the quality the video did great, but I was just personally thinking, the quality's not there, like in terms of the visuals. But with these AI models, I have been chatting to my editor recently, Jorge, and we've been saying like, this enables us to do stuff we couldn't normally do. Like we could make these narratives that we always thought were basically impossible without having an entire, production crew behind us. So that it's enabling in that sense. I don't know, but I'm a little bit hesitant to do that story now because the reaction, as we'll talk about in a moment, has been really strong against those AI visuals. So I want to acknowledge that. So all this is just to say, I've been using AI for a while, for over 10 years, and this is not a sharp transition of Cool World's videos or Cool World's podcast or my research suddenly adopting AI. It's just been a continuum in that sense. But Backlash. Let's talk about Backlash. So yeah, there is a strong public reaction with the common comments being AI slop and something like AI's evil, of that kind. AI slop, I totally agree. Like I hate AI slop. I guess to me, it's just, I define it differently. For me, AI slop would be like the whole video is just spam. Like it's just basically Wikipedia. It's just reading out Wikipedia, or it's, spinning like an idea from Reddit or something, like just something that's all over the internet. It's not novel. It's not new. It's just recycling the same old junk round and round. That to me is what I think of as AI slop. You might have your own definition. I'm interested to hear it, if true. And to me, maybe you disagree. I think the videos we do, I only am interested in doing a video if I feel like I have something totally unique to say about a topic. It is a unique insight you will not find elsewhere. That is always my goal. And that's why I don't do a lot of news videos, because it's like, what can you say? Like, here's the news. Everyone's reporting the same news. It doesn't appeal to me. I always want to offer something new and fresh. So yes, we might sometimes use a visual or something like that that's come from AI. But yeah, that's why I would probably defend a little bit that I don't think that our content is AI slop by any stretch of the imagination. But I do want to hear what you think about this. If you strongly feel like we just shouldn't use it at all, that's an interesting data point to me. And I definitely listen and read your comments, and it has a big impact on what we do. So please take that under advisement. And in terms of AI being evil, that's the other one that some people just feel like ethically it's just totally wrong. And you can certainly make that argument. I'm very sympathetic to the argument because of the concerns we all might have about how it changes society in potentially negative ways. Something like social media, you could easily make that argument, right? Social media has all these negative effects. Weirdly, I never put YouTube in that bucket. I was like, YouTube's not really social media. It's so much more than what Instagram or TikTok are delivering, right? Because you got this amazing educational stuff on here, which is kind of unique. But there is a little bit of that on those other platforms as well. But I think YouTube really thrives in that environment. So you can certainly make the argument that there are these technologies that are bad, and we should monitor them and should get rid of them. But it's also true that there've always been technological developments that have changed jobs. I mean, that's always true. So if you were around when Henry Ford was inventing the car, right, the automobile, and your profession was looking after horses, I don't know, doing their hooves or something, cleaning them, looking after them, giving the hay bales to them, whatever it is, then you might be worried, rightfully so, that your job is about to be displaced. But I don't think society should pivot to protect the jobs of the horse groomers. That's not progress. And so it might be that some routine things we do in video production do get displaced from using Fiverr or this gig economy stuff, which we would normally do for some of this kind of stuff. Maybe some of that will get displaced, but it's not obvious to me that necessarily makes it evil. But maybe I'm a little bit biased here because we have been using it and we've been impressed with it. So yeah, I'm really trying to process this and think through it. And I do want to be thoughtful and listen to both sides. So this is a great place. I think a lot of people have opinions about this. So please do let me know your thoughts here. I guess the one thing I did write down I didn't say about the public backlash issue, that the people in that IAS room, I think, were largely oblivious, or at least much more oblivious to public backlash than someone like me, a sci-comer. I have my foot in both worlds, right? I'm talking to you guys who are just normal folks out there, just interested in science and want to engage with it, but you have other lives outside of science as well. And then there's these kind of elite academics who often don't do a lot of science communication, and they don't have much contact with the reactions from the public in that sense. So I do get the idea from interacting with them that they were a little bit oblivious to any concerns about AI being a problem to use in their work. They certainly were not worried that if I write a paper that was 99% generated by AI, that the public would in any way not like that. That was not a topic that anyone voiced or concerned. Maybe they did in the back of their head, but it certainly wasn't voiced in this discussion. And I think the reason is because there was no fear that AI-assisted science was illegitimate, because they acknowledged that its skills were already comparable, if not superior, to their own research skills. So I think that's the core of it as to why this just wasn't something they were worried about. Historical significance, there was a historian in the room, and they explicitly framed this as a transitional period for society. And yeah, they said this is a historic moment, and they didn't mean that meeting. Actually, to me, that meeting was a little bit historic, but I don't think they meant that meeting. I think they meant that this moment in society, and for science specifically, is one of those moments that historians will look back at and be interested in. And therefore, he said, when the historian said this, there was a giggle and a laugh in the room. But he said, we should be documenting what's happening right now. And that's actually what inspired me to make this video. That's why I'm doing this video, to document what it feels like in this moment, because this is very different from how it felt a few years ago. My last real AI video was about, ChatGPT 3.5 passing my 101 exams. And I'm sure there's going to be which feels like a world away. And I'm sure in 5 years, like this video, I will look back at and be like, wow, there's so much I got wrong. There's so much we completely misjudged. It ended up completely different. I don't know how it will be different, but I'm sure I'll be wrong in so many degrees. And I think that's why it's interesting to make this video, to document it, to express. This is not, a lot of these views are my own views, but a lot of what I've told you is a very common sentiment that was being held by the most elite top brains we have in astrophysics. And that is important and relevant. And then two final points I want to make: democratization of science and paper tsunami, if I've written down here. So yeah, science is normally done by people like me, right? At least astrophysics is normally certainly done by people like me. And that's someone who has spent 3 or 4 years in undergraduate school, a master's degree, 5 years, or in my case, it was 3.5 years, getting a PhD, and then many years of training. And those are the people who normally do science. And they are in their ivory tower, right? We are the product of this filtering. Like, you take the cream off the top and you do that again and again and again. You just end up with this like super rarefied air at the top. And that are the people like me who do science. And that might change, because I often get people, many of you guys have emailed me with ideas. I love it when I get your ideas. Like, what about this idea? Have you tried changing tasks to do this? Or have you tried looking for exomoons in this new way? And those are always really cool. I always just have finite time, right? As you can imagine, I actually have negative time, not just finite time. I have negative time to pursue all these different ideas. But you don't need me anymore. Maybe already, but if not very soon, you do not need me anymore to pursue your own interesting research ideas. You can just consult with these models for $20 a month and do a research paper yourself, and it could easily be comparable. I don't know. That's going to be interesting to see. Will the quality of those papers be indistinguishable to some degree from the quality of papers that someone like me would produce with our 2 decades of training behind us? That's really interesting, because it could mean that science is done by just anyone, really. And that is a big changing of the guard, right? So, I mean, I shouldn't encourage that, because my job is supposed to be dependent on this unique skill set. But I do think it's kind of that same point of technical skills are being neutralized by, it's a great democratization of science by everyone can participate now in a way that's never really been possible before at this scale. And then the consequence of that is, if everyone can do science and lots more people do end up doing science, there will be a lot of science, which is great. But the downside of that is that means a lot of papers. How do we even read that many papers? Because already every day on Archive, which is the repository of new papers in astronomy and all sorts of fields, there are already often dozens of papers to read every day, and you don't have time to read them all. You have to scan through the titles and abstracts as fast as you can. But we could end up with an order or 2 orders of magnitude more papers with this democratization of science, of generate, and not just more people doing science, but even scientists being super users who can now do 3 or 4x papers per year than they used to. So I don't know what the answer to that is either, but there just could be this absolute flood and tsunami wave of papers, of new research. And how do we ingest that? And you can just say, well, use AI to ingest that. But that's not quite the same thing. I need to get in my brain to be a scientist, right? It's not. So I don't know if AI can help with that just yet, unless you're doing Neuralink or something. So that raises a whole question of how are we going to cope with this flood of work that's going to come? And then finally, just to finish off, this is just a personal note here. Why do we even do science? What's the point of it? Now, I know to many people who are not scientists, and I've said this on the channel before, so you probably heard me, and a lot of people, you disagree with me. It seems to happen a lot these days. A lot of people disagree with me. But what I said was, the reason why I personally love science is that I'm a participating actor in it. Right? I like finding things out. I love that process of doing it. It's like being a detective, of going onto a crime scene and trying to figure out what happened. And it's like when you watch a crime show, you don't want the spoiler. You want to play along. You want to try to figure it out for you. It's not much fun just to read the spoiler before you even turn on the show of who the killer was and then try and watch it. And yeah, I don't know what level of enjoyment I would have for a world of science where humans and myself were cut out. We're just not a part of the discovery process anymore. Maybe we like the fact checkers, but even that, I think you can imagine disappearing at some point. And that worries me. I think like science is a bit like art in that sense that, sure, you can have AI generated art and it has its place. It's useful. It's interesting. It can, to some degree, beautify the world to a great extent by having more art in the world. But the art I'm always most compelled about, if I was going to go to a museum and see like the top art, the best, what is the very best that's producible, then I'm interested in like the human story, like what motivated that artist, what was going on in their lives, what inspired them to produce that. And science isn't quite the same, but it is still a human endeavor. It is an act of human beings doing something for the sheer kind of curiosity and love of doing it. I really do believe that science is intrinsically a human endeavor. And if we have these AI models that deliver fusion, that deliver all these drugs, that deliver new theoretical physics breakthroughs, but it's, if this is from a super intelligence, these discoveries might be incomprehensible to me and to many others. Maybe no human being will understand how this fusion machine works that it produces. And there's obviously an economic benefit to that, no doubt. That's interesting and worthwhile. But it does subtract somewhat from this multi-millennial period we've been in of humans being driven to understand the world around us, to transition into a world where we just don't. We just have no understanding of the world around us. That frightens me a little bit. I don't know that I want to live in a world where everything around me is just magic. Living in a fantasy world. I want to live in a world of where I actually can comprehend it, a comprehensible world. So that is a thought that I kind of want to finish on, just thinking about, is what is even the point of replacing all human scientists with machines? I don't know. Like I said, there's a lot in this video, as you can tell. This is very much a live, very unlike our usual videos, a very live, unscripted, raw conversation. And I think it's a conversation we have to have. It's not a conversation I've seen done in quite this way before on YouTube. Hopefully you'll agree this is fairly different. And like I said, the real kicker for me I want to leave you with is that this is not my own personal, this is just all in my head that I'm worried about AI. This is a conversation that the most elite institutes in the world are having emergency internal meetings about. And the smartest people you can name in the world, you can think of, are worried about this. And they see this as a threat to their intellectual supremacy and have even conceded much of their ground to that already. That is that makes you think that this is really happening. This is really happening. This is not just this is coming down the pipe someday. Like, we're in it. We're swimming in it. So lots to say. I'll try and do chapters, because I had 25-ish points on here. I'll try and do chapters for each of these points so you can flick through, go to the different ones. But yeah, please do let me know your thoughts on any of this. There's lots of points here. You could offer your opinion, throw multiple comments, tell me what you think. And this is a conversation not just with scientists, but with the public, because you guys are funding everything we do. And what is the point of science if it's not for public benefit? So this is relevant to not just the future of this channel, not just even science itself, but society itself and how it interacts with these developments. So please do let me know your thoughts, and thank you so much for your patience. If you've made it to the end of this video, I appreciate that. Please do give us a little like and a share. That always helps. And as always, guys, stay thoughtful and stay curious.